Hello and welcome. It is 2 o'clock Central Time, so we'll go ahead and get started. First, I want to thank each of you for joining us today. We do know how valuable your time is, and we appreciate you choosing to spend some of it with us. We've only asked you for 30 minutes today, and we're going to do our best to stay at or under that to make sure that we make the best use of your time. As a quick introduction, Neverfail is a software company that's been in the high availability and disaster recovery space for more than 25 years. We originally started as a disaster recovery consultancy company, and we've done everything from driving servers around in the back of a truck to help companies large and small recover their systems, to ultimately automating those processes through our market-leading Neverfail engine failover solution, which has allowed more than 5,000 companies in 60 countries to sleep better at night. Today, we want to share all that experience with you in hopes that we've learned things we've learned along the way that will help you as well. One of the key concepts we see continually missed in the market is a true understanding of what an outage truly is and how it impacts an organization. So we started with outlining that in our recent e-guide, and we're going to expand on that discussion in our time together today. One quick housekeeping note before we get started. We are tracking the Q&A function within the meeting here, and so feel free to type in questions as they come up, and we will do our best to answer those at the end as time permits. By way of introduction, we will have two speakers today. The one speaking right now is myself, Eric Vaughn. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer for Neverfail. I've been with the organization for 14 years, and I've been fortunate enough to work with partners and customers in this industry for almost 20 years. Which encompasses almost 1,000 high availability and disaster recovery projects from everyone in the Fortune 50 to every branch of the federal government and military to smaller organizations that have critical systems in their environment that can't be down. We're also fortunate enough to have Christopher Lasky with us as well. He is a Neverfail client from Wortham Insurance and Risk Management. Christopher is a Tier 2 Senior Support Specialist there, and he acts as the liaison for the desktop support team and is responsible for maintaining and designing systems that are core to the business. We look forward to hearing some real-world experience from Christopher later in the presentation. And Christopher, thank you for being with us today. Before we dive into the actual anatomy of an outage, I want to set the stage on why this topic matters in the first place. I think we can all agree that no one likes or wants an outage. They're bad for nearly every aspect of a business, from employee morale to productivity, competitiveness, reputation, and more particularly profitability. Now, we're not here today to go into all the statistics about how bad an outage is or can be. The reality is that the impact of an outage is going to be different on every business and in each outage. And while it would be great to be able to quantify each, the reality is most businesses do not. So rather than using this time to try to prove how long a piece of string may be, so to speak, I hope we can agree that every outage has some impact that we would rather avoid if possible or if we had a choice. And regardless of whether you're talking about a Category 5 hurricane as a worst case scenario, a downlink or an application service hanging, downtime does hurt a business, and that might be for 5 minutes or for 5 days. And while we all agree that an outage of any form is bad, I hope we can also agree that avoiding them generally can be worse. The problems that we hear regularly from your peers around the world is that it's easy to get lost due to lack of clarity and internal support, and you also have multiple external forces working against you at any given point in time. As an IT professional, you're continually being asked first and foremost to do more with less. I've seen many of our clients in their offices, they have this sign hanging up as a little bit of a joke, but less budget, fewer people, less resources. All the while, though, project scale and complexity continue to grow, so it truly becomes a balancing act of prioritization. And what makes that even more difficult is that unfortunately those priorities can continually change as well. You also have to deal with unclear directions from the business on what level of protection is truly needed, or more importantly, can be funded. I have countless stories of an IT professional being told that a system can't be down until they present the budget request to actually make that happen. It generally ends up being some version of how much protection can I get for my budget, which is never enough, of course, when an outage occurs. And this can create a difficult balancing act, to say the least. Making it more difficult, potentially, the high availability and disaster recovery market is very large and it's very noisy. You hear all kinds of erroneous claims of no downtime and zero data loss, or one of the more common ones, which is 15-minute RTO or recovery time objective. Very rarely do you ever see those claims to come to fruition, though, so it's hard to differentiate one solution from another, especially when your business is unclear on what level of availability is truly needed. Oftentimes, you don't find out that your chosen solution can't meet those requirements until you needed them to in an outage. Finally, very few organizations have actually gone through the exercise of tiering their application systems based on criticality. So with no true definition of an SLA, you often end up overpaying, underprotecting, or more often than not, having a combination of both. And these realities are a big part of the reason why IT professionals continually say that they're not confident that their disaster recovery plans will work when they need them to. And we know from seeing this firsthand that that's a very tough place to be. So with all the noise surrounding you, it quickly becomes evident that clarity is critical. It's required. And our goal today is to help provide that clarity based on our experience. So let's start by getting on the same page regarding some of these buzzword definitions. For the purpose of our time together today, here's how we define some of these key terms. The first one is high availability. When we talk about high availability, what we mean is your business's ability to restart systems after an outage within the same location or the same site. So continuity of operations within the same place. Whereas disaster recovery means your business's ability to restart those systems in a different location or a different site. It's off-site, it's away, I'm getting rid of a power outage, whatever it may be. DRaaS, or disaster recovery as a service, is the same thing as disaster recovery, but that's a service that is being offered by a third party. So they're providing this service for you, and ultimately the execution responsibility is removed and transferred to that third party, but the risk is not. If there is an outage, if there is downtime, it's ultimately still your business that suffers that price, not the third party. Continuous availability is another term that you may have heard that we use often. And what that refers to is the ability to keep your users continuously working in the critical applications that drive your business, regardless of what causes the outage or what location you choose to fail over to. And finally, business continuity is a word that's often used in the technology space, but it's a bit higher level than that. Business continuity is actually a company-wide effort that encompasses everything from decision-making processes when there is an outage to communication plans, how are we going to communicate internally, and ultimately there is one component of a business continuity plan, which is called a business impact analysis, that actually covers the IT systems and the SLAs in terms of recovery time objective and recovery point objective for recovering these systems. Now, to provide further clarity, it's also helpful to understand that as noisy as the market is, when you look at every single solution that's out there, every one of them falls into one of these four buckets. Now, at the bottom of the scale here, you'll notice that the solutions are primarily focused on helping you to recover, and the primary emphasis or core competency of these solutions is your data. So, of course, you have backup and restoration. There's all kinds of different options here, file level, block level. You have on-site, you have off-site, storage-based solutions versus application or software-based solutions. And that's great. It's some backup is something you need in place typically for retention, whether you're talking about disaster recovery or not. But for lower tier applications that can be down for longer, it's certainly a viable option. Now, when having your data backed up from a day or two ago and the time and risk associated with recovering that data is no longer sufficient, you would typically move into the next bucket, which we call data replication. Again, there are a myriad of options here in terms of how this data can be replicated at the app layer, at the storage layer. You can snapshot, it can be real-time, synchronous or asynchronous. Continuous data protection is a term that was often used in this space a number of years ago. The primary core competency of data replication is getting your data safe from point A to point B. And data is an asset to any organization. It's the cornerstone behind any of these concepts. But at the end of the day, data is nothing but a long line of ones and zeros. It takes users working within applications to turn your data into information. Then and only then can it actually have impact on your business. So again, if you're talking about systems that can afford to be down for a little while and not have impact on the business, it's absolutely a perfect level of protection. But if you're talking about systems that are more important that your business relies on to drive operations, revenue, or what have you, you would typically move up into what we call basic failover. Now, as you move into this phase, you start to go make a shift from recovery-centric solutions into making sure that your applications, infrastructure, and data are highly available. And you also start to shift from just focusing on the data to actually focusing on the application or the application tier or stack. And again, there are lots of options here, everything from clustering inherent to Microsoft applications or others, and default tolerance. Virtual availability is a big key here. Lots of options in terms of availability, at least at the host layer, from tools like VMware and others that are just native within their own vCenter systems. And these can be great, but if you start to look at the cost and the native limitations, whether that be distance limitations between sites, the requirements for identical hardware or identical storage, ultimately you find that this probably offers your broadest range of protection against your applications. But if you're talking about your lower tier apps that can be down for a while, they're going to be overkill. And if you're talking about your most critical applications that can't go down, they're typically not going to be sufficient. So then we get into continuous availability. And again, that's what we refer to as keeping your users connected and working, regardless of what would have caused the outage or what location you're choosing to fail over to. And this now shifts not only from recovery to availability, but now shifts from application emphasis to business emphasis. I've often said that, recovery, availability, disaster recovery is not an IT problem. If a server is sitting in a corner and the lights aren't blinking, the business doesn't necessarily care that that server's down. It's that people in that organization cannot continue to work. And ultimately, that's the impact that we're trying to avoid. Now, with an understanding of the market options, it becomes easier to look at your systems and the criticality of each, and you're quickly going to realize that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. It just doesn't exist. Your environment has different applications at differing criticality. So applying one solution can make ordering easier, sure, but it'll always end up either underprotecting critical systems or overpaying for less important systems, or oftentimes both. So the best answer in our experience in terms of what we've found is to quickly go through a tiering exercise. Now, the good news is you don't need a six-figure contract with a big 5 consulting firm to accomplish this. You just need to get the right people into the conversation and ask them the right questions. This will allow you to tier your systems appropriately based off of criticality of the business and the business units, and have an actual business conversation that's going to gain buy-in from your sponsors, but also create the business case for budget by applying the right level of protection and spend to each system. So clarity, agreement, and approval are all key items for any project, and this process is helpful because it ensures all three, and now you're just left with obviously executing against those SLAs. Now, once you've done the tiering exercise, it's important to note that these SLAs are not soft lines that maybe will meet in certain scenarios. These are hard lines that have to be met in all scenarios and at all times. So in order to do that, you have to understand the dependencies that your solutions are based on and what actually makes up an outage. And this is where the anatomy of an outage concept becomes absolutely critical. Most people think of an outage in terms of failover times, 15-minute failover, 30-minute failover, whatever it may be. And while failover is an important part of recovering from an outage, and it might be the easiest to deal with, it certainly isn't the only part of an outage. It starts by identifying that you've even had an issue. Then you need to determine if you can quickly fix it or if you need to enact failover. Then you actually fail over, but at some point in time, you're going to need to recover back to your production server or within that environment. An issue in any one of these stages can completely blow your recovery time objectives and your SLAs, but most people are either not aware of each of these phases or don't think of an outage in terms and ultimately their outage response leads to that as well. So now I think it's imperative that we go ahead and dissect each of these phases. Stage one is awareness. The first stage of any outage is just this, awareness, knowing that you're even having an outage to begin with. Because an outage doesn't start when the failover starts, it actually is what leads to the possible requirement for a failover. Now, how do you determine when you're having an issue? Some of you have monitoring tools in place, which are great, and they're going to handle a lot of the awareness stage for you, but they're not generally complete. For example, you might be monitoring your hardware and all the metrics are in line and showing as functional, but your carrier is down so no one can actually get to it. And you may even have layer 2 monitoring across your network connections that identify that quickly as well, but your SQL database has a hung service, so a key report won't generate prior to a board meeting. That's a real world example, not a good one. I could go on and on here, obviously, but the point is, like a snowball rolling down a hill, most organizations do not have 100% closed loop monitoring in place. So often the identification of an issue comes from your users calling or emailing your team. And at that point, it's too late because the business has already been impacted. In our experience across tens of thousands of environments, I can say without a doubt that this is generally the longest part of an outage and can often last a full day or more before your 15-minute failover actually even has a chance to go into effect. So once we've gotten through the awareness stage and we've become notified, stage 2 is resolution. And once you've identified that you have that issue, then you have to take the time to determine whether it can be quickly fixed or if you in fact need to enact failover. The process is time consuming, as you're probably much more well aware of than I am, because it is generally manual. The typical triage process comes into play here, where you're looking at everything that could go wrong within that system until you ultimately find out what is wrong. And how long that takes can be dependent on the issue, can be dependent on the environment that you're working within, and ultimately who may be available to go and do this manual work. So, you know, that process can take 5 minutes in some cases or 5 hours in others. It really just depends on the scenario. The key point here is that your users are still down during this stage. So the outage is ongoing. We're simply trying to remediate and figure out if we can fix this quickly or if we need to enact failover. And that takes us to stage 3 failover. Once I've determined that that issue cannot be quickly resolved, I finally get to this overhyped failover stage that we've been talking about. This is where that 15-minute failover actually gets to shine, but you have to ask yourself, what dependencies is that 15-minute failover time actually tied to? Oftentimes, those 15-minute failover times assume that the failover hardware and or the environment are ready and in place with no issues. It could also have to assume that the backups from 2 days ago are on the same operating system and application version and can even be recovered, or that someone in your organization is available to facilitate that failover process. But what happens if one of those dependencies are in fact not available? What happens in a hurricane, for example, when your people are more concerned with their home or their family, or if it's 3 a.m. and the person that you need is locked in dreamland and actually doesn't even hear their phone ring over and over and over again? The answer is that ultimately your SLA is going to be blown, and unfortunately that's what ends up happening more often than not. Now, most people think that an outage actually ends at failover, right? All the planning, everything that we've done, we purchased and implemented a system, we have our failover system in place, we can check that box and move on. We've had an outage, I'm gonna go ahead and fail over, we're good to go. But if you stop to think about it, the reality is that you're generally only halfway through the process at the point of failover occurring. At some point, you have to get back to the production environment, because while the users should theoretically still be working after failover, your business is now unprotected. Right? The whole reason that you put failover into your environment in the first place has been mitigated because you only have one server in place. So you need to get back to that production environment in order to have your failover environment prepared to handle that next issue. Best case scenario, generally speaking, across the market, you're going to repeat that failover process all over again. Worst case, though, you completely have to rebuild the production environment from backups, from tapes, whatever it may be. Really depends on what the solution is and ultimately what caused the outage. So regardless of what that path actually looks like, with most high availability and disaster recovery solutions, you are going to have a second outage getting back over to production, and that has to be considered as part of your SLA requirement. Because again, if you've made a promise to the business that we're going to have a 15-minute recovery time objective, for example, on a particular system that the business depends on, you've made that commitment that that can happen in all scenarios. And so, these dependencies in the full process becomes extremely critical. So hopefully you can now see how a 15-minute failover solution can actually mean a 4 to 24-hour outage easily. In fact, this is exactly what happens more often than not, unfortunately. But hopefully now, with this understanding and knowing what to look for and what to plan for as part of your high availability disaster recovery or business continuity planning, you'll be better prepared so that you're in a better position to ensure that your SLAs are always met in every situation, just like you promised to the business. So how do we put all this together? Hopefully by now, in this short time, you have a better understanding of the complexity and the risks that actually make outages even more difficult to overcome. This is not an easy problem. There's a lot of complexity, certainly, but hopefully also you realize that having this understanding can lead to better decisions for you and your business, and that better decisions are ultimately going to lead to mitigated risk across all scenarios, which is the key and the end game that you're trying to get to. So when you put it all together, that can mean fewer late nights for you, less weekend work that I know we all love so much. I hear about those things often. People also, please also know that Neverfail is here to help, as we've done for so many of your peers around the world. We have solutions that automate and facilitate every stage of this process we just walked through so that you can focus on your more critical business projects while at the same time having full confidence that your key systems will always be available when you need them to be, i.e. you don't have to worry. And now today is not, the intent of today was certainly not to be a sales pitch, so I'll stop there for now, but know that we would certainly love to speak to each of you further if this message resonates or there's things that you believe that we can do to help. Now realizing that it's one thing to hear this from Neverfail as the vendor, but another to hear it from an actual peer, I would also like to introduce Christopher Lasky from Wortham, as I introduced in the beginning of the call, to talk a little bit about his experience in this arena, assuming that we've got the audio all connected up. So Christopher, are you there? Are you online?
Yeah, I'm here.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us. Appreciate it. If you would, please talk a little bit to the group here about kind of your experience as it pertains to kind of this anatomy of an outage or disaster recovery and some of the things that you've done to help your business mitigate.
Yeah, sure. To give everyone a little bit better understanding, we've been using the Neverfail products for several years. I've been at Marsh Wortham almost 10 years now, and when I was brought on board, we were using it then. It's been probably, I would say, some of the best performing software that we have here in terms of its reliability, ease of use. Starting out, I was briefed by a senior employee here who was more familiar with the application, and over the course of 10 years, I've become more familiar with it, and now I'm the basically lead in charge of the software. And of course, Marsh Wortham, we're in the Houston office, so we're in the Gulf Coast region. The biggest impact that we've seen is probably what everybody's expecting, which is Hurricane Harvey. Absolutely, destroying some of our offices. We got 2 of our bottom floors got filled full of water. All the electrical was gone. It took almost a full year for our building to be repaired. So, having the flexibility to, on demand switch our applications seamlessly to our secondary site is absolutely critical. It saved us, hundreds of man hours. I was actually out of the country at the time. And this is the second time I've been out of the country during a horrible disaster. And I, of course, dreading this hurricane coming and knowing what it would do to our business, really was the difference between life or death. It would have been very difficult overseas to, connect in and start trying to initiate some kind of long recovery process. But, with Neverfail, it was, seamless, a few clicks of a button. And, we initiated our switch over even before the hurricane had made landfall in Houston, knowing the impact that would occur. So yeah, it's been, like I said, some of the most easiest, and definitely some of the best time consuming software that I've used here. We use it for all of our Exchange servers, our large document management system for the entire firm, which is about 14 terabytes of data for not just Houston, but we have offices in every city in Texas: Austin, San Antonio, Fort Worth, Dallas, and they all, deposit documents in the same centralized file repository, which we keep synchronized to a secondary server in case we have any issues, which we have in the past. And then we use it for a few critical SQL servers as well. So a lot of applications that are deemed, mission critical, cannot go down whatsoever, are all protected by the Neverfail solution. So it has just been something that I can't say enough good things about it, because it has saved me personally a tremendous amount of time and work, making sure that our applications are protected. And I mean, just, I've lived in Houston my whole life, and I've been through, 2, 3-ish large storms already. And so I can't imagine anyone who lives in an area that, gets hit with these things every, 5 or 10 years wouldn't want something to keep it protected, just because of the nature of hurricanes and what it can do to your business. So, yeah, that's been my personal experience with the software over the last couple of years.
So Christopher, if I heard you correctly, you have so much confidence in Neverfail that you don't mind leaving the country when disasters are coming, because you can press a button, right? Maybe just go hang out at the time.
Well, I wouldn't tell my boss that. But,
no, thank you very much, Christopher.
Yeah, no problem.
Appreciate your time, and I'm sure that folks on this line it was very helpful as well. So appreciate it. So there's obviously, folks, much more around this topic that could and probably should be covered, but we want to be respectful of the time that we've asked you for, which we're coming up on here. My hope is that this has provided a solid overview and a good foundation to assess your business against, or potentially even start from. And so if you're not fully confident in your business's abilities to meet those SLAs and continue operations on your key systems, we would certainly love a chance to discuss that further with you and see if there's ways that we can be of assistance to your business, like we've been able to be with Christopher and 5,000 other organizations around the world. If you're interested in learning more, we would certainly be happy to help. Feel free to send us a note to the email you see here, sales@neverfail.com, and we'll be happy to set up a consultation. And even if nothing else, it might just validate that you're doing all the right things, which is also a good thing as well. So with that, I will bid you adieu for the day. I appreciate everyone's time again, and we certainly look forward to the opportunity to speak with you all again in the near future. Take care.